Hello and welcome to tonight's online talk. As you can see, we're back in the museum. We've had a fairly busy week. The staff have been working really hard to make sure we're COVID-19 safe. People have been coming through for Spy Oxfordshire, so if you missed Dr. Christopher Moran's talk on Ian Fleming last month, do access the website where you'll find not just the talk, but also information about our opening times, our admission charges, and also the opportunity to either have a virtual tour or indeed to have a private tour in the galleries if you would prefer. Tonight's talk is our first in the Great War series, and we know much of this young officer's life with the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry through the work of the Great War regimental historian Simon Harris. For him, it was a personal piece of family research. You'll meet Simon in our live Q&A following the talk. The museum isn't just about galleries, we also offer a research service ourselves, using our excellent library and archives. It's run by our staff, but also a small team of dedicated volunteers. Again, visit the website, you'll see some testimonials and also how to submit an inquiry for the research panel to review and to respond to. Who knows, you might find some interesting facts about one of your ancestors. COVID-19 has had a devastating effect on all museums. If you are able to make a donation following the talk, we'd be extremely grateful. And indeed, if you could come to the galleries, bring your family and friends and have a look around, that too would be much appreciated. I hope you enjoy this evening, and I really look forward to welcoming you back to the galleries. Good night.
And welcome to the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum for this Great War story. These days, we look back upon the 4 monumental years of the Great War and wonder at the casualties, at the cost in terms of lives lost, and at the scarring upon the succeeding generations. It is unlikely that a single family in this country came through it unscathed. The 1st of July, 1916 was the opening day of the Battle of the Somme. And by the end of that day, nearly 20,000 British soldiers had died. And the battle dragged on until the middle of November that year. And by then, nearly 1 million casualties of British soldiers. During the centenary years of the Great War, we at the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum remembered the nearly 6,000 dead in our 2 county regiments, the Oxfordshire Yeomanry and the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. The statistics, of course, make grim reading, but beneath them are the personal stories of those who died and the families which mourned the tragedies of these deaths. Tonight, we are uncovering the story of just one of these, Captain Ralph Kite, an officer in the 2nd Battalion, the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, the 52nd. The same regiment which fought at Waterloo in 1815 and which fought at Pegasus Bridge in the early hours of D-Day, 1944. The regiment's stories of these battles have featured already in our series of online talks. Kite was wounded in November 1916 in the last of the Somme battles and died a month later from his wounds. This is about one man whose story was found and told by his great-nephew, Simon Harris, almost 90 years after Ralph Kite's untimely death. But it stands, I think, for all those families up and down the land whose history includes a Great War death. What is remarkable, however, is that the unearthing of the story has brought to life again this young man who died in 1916 and allows us to know him a little and to salute his sacrifice. He was 21. Ralph Kite, a very parfit gentle knight. The words of Alice Batt, who nursed him before he died. And this is a picture of the shell shard which killed him, probably from Canadian artillery. It is jagged, as you see, and weighs nearly half a pound. This is Billingford Rectory, where he was born in April 1895. Billingford is between Swanton Morley and Reefham in North Norfolk. His parents were Bertie Kite, a clergyman and the rector of Billingford, and his wife Edie. Her son's death 21 years later blighted the rest of her life. Australia. In 1897, Bertie was appointed to be the Dean of St David's Cathedral in Hobart. The family's first view of Hobart from the deck of their ship was probably this: St David's Cathedral, as the Kites would have known it, and the deanery where young Ralph was brought up as a boy with his older sister Muriel. The Bishop of Hobart was Henry Montgomery, seen here with his wife Maud. They had 2 children. This was one of them. The Field Marshal as a boy and a young man. He was 8 years older than Ralph Kite. My impression is that the Kite family did not always find him an agreeable boy. When he was 10, young Ralph came home to prep school in Epsom, and from there he passed the entrance exam into Marlborough in 1909. Marlborough was his father's old school and founded for the education of the sons of the clergy. He was in B2 House on the first floor of the building in the centre of this picture. Like most schools at the time, Marlborough would have been quite tough. Unlike his father, young Ralph was not an academic. Apart from some cricket, best for him, it seems, was his time in the Officer Training Corps. Good grounding, perhaps, for his short career as a soldier. Today at Marlborough, he is remembered on the College War Memorial and for his name scratched on a desk, some graffiti only discovered 100 years later. In B2, Ralph's house at Marlborough, 1 in 4 died in the war to come. 1 in 5 were awarded the Distinguished Service Order or the Military Cross for their gallantry in fighting for king and country. Also in B House at the time was young Sidney Woodruff, a Great War Victoria Cross, killed in 1915 while serving in the Rifle Brigade, an outstanding intellect and sportsman. In 1913, rather to everyone's surprise, including his own, Ralph Kite won a place at Keble, Oxford, to read classics. His father, Bertie, had been there 35 years before. Here he is, on the left of a group of contemporaries at Keble. Many would have died in the war. Of the 13 of them in the picture, 7 have pipes clenched between their teeth. The family memory of this time is that Ralph rather enjoyed himself and had some heroic moments playing rugby for his college. He is the middle one of these 3, and at Keble he was known as Kitty Kite. Again, the Officer Training Corps attracted his attention. Here he is, on the left, with 3 friends at annual camp at Aldershot. And then on the 28th of June, 1914, there was an assassination in Sarajevo. And thereafter, Europe is on a downward spiral into war. Whatever the clouds gathering just ahead, it was the end of the summer half at Oxford. There were different interests to pursue for the young Ralph, and he was in a house party in Ireland with the Montgomery family when war was declared on the 4th of August, 1914. 2 weeks later, Ralph started a short 3-month course at Sandhurst for officer training, for which his clergyman father in Tasmania had to pay. Ralph Kite is commissioned into the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry on the 11th of November, 1914. The same day, the 2nd Battalion of his regiment is fighting just to the east of Ypres on the Western Front, in the best known of their many battles of the Great War, the destruction of the Prussian Guard in a wood called Noniboshen. On being commissioned, he is posted to the 3rd Battalion, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, a training battalion based in Cambridge Barracks, Portsmouth, now the home of Portsmouth Grammar School. In spite of his family links with the regiment through the Ruck-Keene family, it is through his Oxford College that he gains his commission into the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. Ralph is here for 4 months, training soldiers for the 2 regular battalions of his regiment. Until March 1915, when he crosses the Channel to Harfleur, a rather miserable tented base camp on his way to join the 2nd Battalion. When Kite joins his battalion, which is part of the 5th Brigade in the 2nd Division, they are in the sector defined by Richebourg-Lavouet, Festubert and Le Plantin, just south of Ypres. Kite became a platoon commander in A Company, and 2 of the main personalities in his new life were these: the commanding officer, Archibald Eden, and the adjutant, Richard Cross. To give you a feel for the country around, this is Rue du Bois in Richebourg-Lavouet before the war. Ralph Kite would more likely have recognized this. With a high water table, there was no alternative to building breastworks above ground. His battalion would fight forward from here in May 1915 in the coming Battle of Festubert. In anticipation of the battle to come, Ralph Kite wrote to his mother,
"We're hoping for an advance of some sort, although it seems it must cost us enormously. I should like to get at the Hun, if only because they've done in a lot of my pals."
These very local views illustrate the kind of terrain they would have to deal with in their advance. The Battle of Festubert was fought from May the 15th to the 25th, 1915. It was preceded by an artillery barrage that lasted for 60 hours. But faulty fuses in the shells and the soft ground meant that this was less effective than planned. The 52nd would play their part in the early stages at Richebourg-Lavouet. They would be attacking from the northwest towards the southeast, and Ralph Kite's battalion was in the 2nd wave of the assault. On a frontage of about 1.5 miles, the 3 leading British brigades had 10,000 men. Opposite them were 2,200 men of the 55th Regiment of the German Army, mostly drawn from Westphalia. This was the opening phase of the Battle of Festubert and involved the 52nd in the first night attack of the war. Look at the red-marked cross on this slide. This is where they started from, heading southeast down a cinder track. Their object was the Ferme du Poix, marked here in green, and it proved very costly. Of the 2 company commanders shown here, one was killed, the other missing in action. By the end of the battle, Kite was the only uninjured officer in his company. This section of original trench map shows the position of the 52nd, in green, flanked by the Worcesters on their left and 6th Brigade on their right, as they are about to assault southeastwards down the cinder track towards the unobtainable Ferme du Bois, just over half a mile away. They achieved some success, got to V1, R6 and R7, but then as the light came up, they got stuck by ferocious German resistance. 6th Brigade to the right got a bit further. The Worcesters made no progress at all. The Germans were ready and waiting. At V1, the figures that dominate are Lieutenant Ernest Whitfeld, who killed a German machine gun crew with the bomb and the bayonet, but was wounded himself and had to retire, and Kite, who then took over the defense of V1, and with a few men held this position during the night of the 15th and 16th of May and the better part of the next day. The Germans were in the same trench, separated by a trench block of sandbags, each side throwing bombs at the other. No wonder Ralph Kite said, "We had 3 days in bloody hell." Fred Clare, perhaps the most outstanding NCO of the 52nd in the war, was in the trench with Ralph Kite as a sergeant, and his comments on the slide were written after Ralph Kite's death in 1916. The cinder track today, looking towards the Ferme du Bois, the regiment's objective in May 1915, and a closer picture. The actual position of V1 is where the ditch turns at right angles to the left. Also shown is a pigeon egg grenade found at V1. The Ferme du Bois objective is in the trees on the skyline. This slide shows the number of casualties suffered by the 52nd at the Battle of Festubert, with a memorial to their missing dead. The inset photos are of Ralph Kite's friends. Remember, he had been with the battalion for about 7 weeks by this stage. This, his first battle, turned his world upside down. After being relieved in their Richebourg-Loverway position by a Sikh battalion on the 18th of May, the Indian Army were very evident in this battle. The 52nd were withdrawn to gather themselves and receive drafts of replacements. The 23rd of May was Whit Sunday, and this man, Llewellyn Gwynn, Bishop of Khartoum, and looked upon by the 52nd as their chaplain, held an open-air service for the regiment, followed by short company memorial services for the fallen. He would conclude, "And now, boys, let us pray for peace. A just peace and a lasting peace. But mind," wagging his finger at them, "mind, you've got to beat the enemy first." For the 2 months, August until October 1915, Ralph Kite was seconded away from the 52nd to run the 5th Brigade bombing school. The aim was to improve training in the use of hand grenades and so reduce the number of casualties from bombing accidents. Ralph Kite described it as a suicide club. Unusually, there were no casualties during his time in charge, but shortly after this, a ruck-keen cousin was killed in just such an accident. His time at the brigade bombing school may have extended Ralph's short life, as he missed the Battle of Loos in September 1915, where the 52nd suffered another 235 casualties. He rejoined his battalion, however, in time to spend a wet winter in and out of the trench line just to the south of Bethune. This picture just about says it all. Ralph Kite wrote home,
The trenches are very muddy and wet. We don't get on so bad though, in spite of the difficulties. I have a first-class fur-lined coat and several woolly waistcoats, so don't suffer much from the cold. Nothing short of a suit of corrugated iron will keep out the wet. The country's changed since the summer. When we used to have green fields, we now have mud flats, very misty and dreary.
Improving weather in the early spring of 1916 allowed the 52nd's officers some relief in riding. Kite had by this time a horse he called the Crump. All the pre-war officers were comfortable in the saddle, many having played polo before the war. Riding was new, however, to some of the wartime officers, who were given lessons by the likes of Cross, the adjutant, which is why it was called the Wild West Show. Kite had learned to ride in Tasmania as a boy. He is nearest to the camera here. Most importantly, time had to be found for training, especially as drafts of reinforcements had to be assimilated into the companies. Here with the Lewis gun, and here with the Vickers machine gun. Kite, fourth from left and bareheaded. The 52nd spent much of the early summer of 1916 in the infamous Zouave Valley, close to the equally infamous Vimy Ridge. It was so called because in 1915, French colonial troops from Algeria, or Zouaves as they were called, had been slaughtered in the valley by the thousand. Their bodies, clad in unsuitable red pantaloons and blue tunics, lay unburied for weeks because of dominating German artillery fire. It is still called Zouave Valley today. Now it looks like this. In 1916, it was a most unhealthy place, being dominated by German artillery and sniper fire. In July, a week after the start of the Battle of the Somme, in which they were not immediately engaged, Colonel Eden gave up command of the 52nd to Richard Cross, who had been the adjutant and who was almost immediately deep into planning his battalion's part in an action just to the south of Delville Wood, between Waterlot Farm and Guillemont Station. The plan was for 2 companies of the 52nd to support 90 Brigade as they attacked Guillemont, with 2 other companies to assault due eastwards towards Gachy. After 15 months with the battalion, Captain Ralph Kite was now a company commander and was responsible for between 90 and 100 men of D Company. Their role here was to cross the open ground towards Gachy. This is how the attack would have looked from the enemy's side, with A and D companies coming across the open ground towards the camera. And this is the enemy. A and D companies of the 52nd attacked the German trench line towards Gachy. In daylight and in such a formation, they look vulnerable. Kite, the D Company commander, is forbidden by Richard Cross, the commanding officer, from leading his men into action. According to his letters, he found this order difficult to obey. Some officers and NCOs were always kept back in view of the inevitable casualties as a cadre to train the replacements. Both attacks fail. This slide shows the 30th of July 1916 casualties for the 52nd and a portrait of Ralph Kite's greatest regimental friend, Jack Hardcastle, who was killed in action trying to reach Guillemont Station, along with an original grave marker which records the deaths of 6 officers and a number of men of Hardcastle's company. His grave actually was lost, and his name is recorded on the Thiepval Memorial. The grave marker can be seen in Broughton Pog's Church in West Oxfordshire, where the Hardcastles lived. Kite felt bad about being left out of this battle, and Hardcastle's death hit him very hard. In a letter to his parents, he said,
"I lost a very dear friend, Jack Hardcastle, who threw his life away through inexperience. It's very hard to forget our losses, but I know he's waiting on the other side."
Waiting on the other side makes the family feel that Ralph Kite knew his days were already numbered. He had lost many friends, people he had known at Marlborough, at Keble, and in the regiment. Shortly after this, the London Gazette confirmed that Captain Ralph Kite had been awarded the Military Cross for conspicuous gallantry during operations. In fact, it is not entirely clear in which operations he earned the award, but it is quite possibly at Richebourg-Loveway the previous year. And in September, he had a spot of home leave, this time with the family in West London, as his father was just back from Tasmania. Bertie Kite's new living was at St. Peter's, Ealing. Let's hope he saw some bright lights in town, but according to his sister Muriel, Ralph followed his clergyman father around a bit like a lost child. The end of leave, back to the front, Edie Kite seeing her boy off. Julian Bickersteth, an army chaplain, described the scene at Victoria Station. "It is a wonderful sight to see," he wrote. 1,500 men and officers returning to the front after leave. What struck me most was the cheerful bravery of the women, who sent their men off almost invariably with a smile. The final battle of the July Somme offensive was fought in November to remove a German salient into the British lines just north of the River Ancre at Serres and Beaumont-Hamel, marked here in red. We last saw the 52nd just south of Delville Wood, in the area marked in yellow here. It looks peaceful enough, but this final push in November 1916 was a huge effort in terms of manpower engaged, 44,000 men. The 52nd, still in the 2nd Division, but by now part of General Hubert Gough's 5th Army, were to attack almost due east to capture the Redan Ridge, held then by this well-dug-in enemy, miners from Silesia, preceded by a prolonged and most intense softening up artillery barrage to destroy the enemy wire and to neutralize the enemy positions. The 52nd made their way into their assault positions via a network of communication trenches, with Ralph Kite's D Company as the front right company behind the 17th Royal Fusiliers. Today, this is the view uphill from their starting position. They might have looked like this as they got going and headed off close behind a rolling artillery barrage. Maybe too close, or maybe it was a rogue shell, because Ralph Kite, who was behind his lead platoons, was hit in the right shoulder. His commanding officer, Cross, said he had followed too closely, but we shall never really know. Certainly, the Fifth Army instruction was to follow up a rolling barrage as closely as possible. Kite was carried off the battlefield by one of his D Company corporals, Jack Ward, and taken to an advanced dressing station in the cellar of this house, Les Bifs, back on the Mailly-Maillet road. Thence to number 43, casualty clearing station at Valincourt, between Arras and Amiens. Beyond a redressing of his wound, it is uncertain what might have been done here, before he was transferred from Valincourt to Le Tréport by a French ambulance train. The French in World War I were notorious for the substandard care of their wounded. There was no water on the train, only beer and wine. Ralph Kite arrived in Le Tréport in a parlous state, nearly dead from hemorrhage and dehydration. At the station, female ambulance drivers collected the wounded and took them to the various hospitals in the town. Female drivers were reputed to be more sympathetic and caring of their wounded charges. Ralph Kite was brought here to number 10 British Red Cross Hospital, better known as Lady Murray's Hospital. Lady Helen Stuart Murray, a daughter of the Duke of Atholl, was the lady who ran it, and these are some of the nurses there who would have been involved in his care. X-ray had been in use for some years by this stage, and there were machines in Le Tréport, although not at Lady Murray's Hospital. The most regrettable fact is that Ralph Kite's wound was not X-rayed. Failure to find and remove this shell shard made the risk of infection much greater. This is what shotgun pellets look like on an X-ray. Here also is the shell shard which killed Ralph Kite, superimposed on the same X-ray. It would have been very obvious if even an elementary X-ray had been taken. The shard was lodged unseen in the brachial plexus. Every breath would have been painful for him. The nurses reported that Ralph Kite never murmured when the dressing was being changed. Eventually, infection set in, which affected the main artery in the arm and led to profuse bleeding. The wound was explored and the shard was at last removed. Later, as a last resort, the arm was amputated. When Ralph Kite was first admitted to Lady Murray's, his parents were allowed across to France to visit him. This was not unusual at the base hospitals for seriously wounded men. Thinking that their son was on the mend, the Kites had gone back to Ealing. When matters became critical, however, they were summoned back to Le Tréport and saw him before the final operation, the amputation. His parents were with him when he came to from the anaesthetic. He spoke to them, along with a few words of thanks to the doctors and nurses, and died soon afterwards. The room in which he died is marked with a red arrow in the slide. Nurse Alice Batt cared for Ralph Kite for a time, and after she died in 1969, her diary came to light and was published. She wrote,
10th of December 1916. The last few nights have been very wearing and something of a strain, with 2 very ill patients on this floor of the hospital. And now tonight we all feel very sad, as the nicest patient, a young captain in the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, died this afternoon. He was a dear, so courteous and patient. It was a real joy to do anything for him. A very parfit gentil knight. The last few nights he's been frightfully ill, and one knew there was little hope. He had a deep shrapnel wound in the right arm, and after the piece was removed, had 2 bad attacks of hemorrhage within a few days. His parents, it is for them, not him, one feels such awful pity. arrived in time to see him, which was something. He was an only son. Tonight feels very blank without him to look after. Sister used to sit with him most of the night, leaving the other patients to me, and then I took my turn to relieve her. Considering his fearful loss of blood, he held his own wonderfully rarely. But last night, sitting there, we felt that death could not be far off, and had the feeling that his spirit was becoming remote. And in spite of the wonderful skill of the doctors and nursing, nothing could keep him back from that undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns.
The burial in Le Tréport took place the following day. An ambulance was used as a hearse. Pallbearers on either side with an honour guard of 100 men for this fallen officer. The Union flag upon his coffin. At the cemetery gates you can see his father wearing a dark overcoat. Back to the camera, holding an umbrella. The coffin is lowered into the ground by the wall. The lady in the dark coat could be Lady Helen Murray or the hospital matron. The inset photograph is of Edie Kite, who is not thought to have attended her son's funeral. The grave at the time of the funeral, and as you see it today. Edie Kite kept the original wooden cross at the foot of her bed for the rest of her life. The view is out to sea, to the northwest, and to England. Thank you for joining us this evening, but please stay with us because we're going to be joined by Dr. Simon Harris, Ralph Kite's great-nephew. It is entirely due to Simon Harris's efforts that we've been able to tell you this story.
The question and answer session will start shortly. The Q&A window will open below the video window. Please log in or use the guest chat link to ask a question.
Hello there, and welcome to the live Q&A following that talk about Ralph Kite. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I'm especially glad to be able to welcome Simon Harris tonight. Simon Harris from his home in Norfolk is joining us because he is really the inspiration for the talk tonight. He wrote the story about his great uncle, Ralph Kite, in this little book here. And it's a magnificent tale. And this story, researched in so much detail that we've been able to tell really a remarkable tale tonight about the short life of this young infantry officer. Of course, it's one thing to write about your ancestor and his story in the Great War so long ago. And I hope that actually this might inspire some others of you who have not yet done that, because most families, as we said in the introduction, would have been touched, affected, scarred even by the Great War. And there are some remarkable stories to be told and remarkable opportunities to research them through the internet and so on. But telling the story of your great uncle is one thing, but then to go on and discover, as you get to the end of that monumental piece of work, monumental for most people, is that the regiment to which Ralph Kite belonged, the 52nd, had in fact no written account of its Great War history. A remarkable thing, really. This was a regular battalion. It was only a battalion. It was a regular battalion, though. And you'd have thought that officers of that battalion who survived the Great War, and some did, of course, would have set about doing that. But in fact, it was never done. And Simon Harris discovered, having written about Ralph Kite, his great uncle, that this was the case. And so he amazingly set about doing it himself. And this is the result. He's produced here the most magnificent account, written account of the 52nd in the Great War years. It's beautifully produced. It's beautifully presented, wonderfully researched, superb maps and diagrams, and a most comprehensive index. Altogether, it's a really magnificent work about the Great War, and unusual too, because it's written recently. It's not written at the time of the Great War or immediately after it, as most were in those days. So it's a superb work. And Simon, sparing your blushes, I would like to congratulate you. And on behalf of the survivors, if you like, of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, some of whom I hope are able to see the talk tonight, I'd like to salute you for the terrific work that you've done. You dedicated the book to Richard Cross, the commanding officer. But I think maybe the first question here is, how on earth did you start all this? How did you get into it? And where did you begin?
Well, thank you very much, and good evening. I was staying with my grandmother. I was 10 or 11 years old. And late one night, she came into my bedroom with a great chunk of metal, which she told me had killed her brother. I didn't sleep very well that night. And the next day, she came with a white suitcase, and in it were 750 documents, letters, dealing with his prep school, Marlborough, university at Oxford, and then his time in the trenches with the 52nd. Also, there were things like his toothbrush and socks that he'd worn, still with the mud of Picardy attached to them. And I then put them to the back of my mind until the early 2000s, when I partially retired from my hospital job, and I decided to look into it a little bit more. By this stage, my grandmother was dead, and my youngest brother, Ralph, had inherited the letters, etc., and he gave me free access to them. And out of that came the biography, RBK, A Very Parfit Gentil Knight. I might add that I had enormous help from people like David Stanley at Slade Barracks. And of course, I spent quite a long time going through all the relevant battalion, brigade, and divisional papers that are in the National Archives, as they now call it. And that's really where it came from. It was David Stanley who said to me when I went and met him in the Slade Barracks, he told me that no one had ever written the First World War history of the 52nd. He said it will be a lot of work, but having worked hard on the years 1915 and 16 with Ralph Kite, I thought it was worthwhile to go on and try and complete the job for the 52nd. And that's where the history came from.
Well, I salute you, because it's a terrific piece of scholarship, actually, as much as anything else. And future generations will always be grateful to you for it. I noticed that we talked about the dedication you made in the book to Richard Cross. And Richard Cross, of course, as the commanding officer for so many of those war years, was a great figure. He would have featured enormously in your research, I guess.
Indeed. And I think that Cross was one of the great regimental commanders of the First World War. He started the war as the adjutant. He knew all his 800 men's regimental numbers. He still knew them, incidentally, 50 years later, which is pretty extraordinary. In July 1916, he took over the command of the 52nd from Archibald Eden, and he commanded them until 1919. And really, I think the performance of the 52nd in the Great War, which was outstanding, was largely down to him. He ended up, quite rightly, with a DSO on bar. If they had given a military general service medal for the First World War, and they did actually think about it, I understand, he'd have had no less than 28 clasps, all for close contact with the enemy. In the Peninsular War of a century before, the highest number of clasps, the greatest number of clasps, was just 14. And I think that says a lot about him. Men did not serve under him, they served with him. He was unbelievably kind and supportive to the relatives of men who had fallen in the war, and in particular my great-grandparents, the Reverend Bertie and his wife Edie Kite. Each year, at the time of Ralph Kite's birthday, the 21st of April, Richard Cross would write to them. I mean, his own birthday was on the 17th, which may have sort of triggered things, but this continued up until the Kites died at the beginning of the Second World War. He also, while suffering a nasty wound to the back that he got at Triangle Copse in August 1918, he was trotting off to Spinks to see what should be inscribed on Ralph Kite's military cross. And when he went actually back to the front, because he didn't want to leave his regiment for fear of losing the command, if you're away for too long wounded, you lost the command potentially, they had to sit him on his horse, lift him up and sit him on his horse for him to be able to move round at all. He was a really extraordinary man. And when he died in 1970, he said, you know, I've had enough of this life. Basically, I'm like Old Man River. You know, I'm tired of living and I'm not afraid of dying. And soon afterwards, he did actually die. A very, very great man. And that is why I dedicated the history to him rather than to anyone else.
I think that's a very good, a wonderful thing to do and a wonderful record for us to have today. We've got a question here from a doctor. You're a doctor, you're an anaesthetist, Simon, and this is from Pat Lawrence, who I know, a doctor, a retired doctor, who wants to know about Fred Clare. Is the NCO Fred Clare, who we talked about at the Cinder Track, didn't we, in that earlier battle, related to a senior quartermaster in the volunteer battalion? Did he have descendants who served on in the volunteer battalion?
Don't know about that, but he certainly had a son.
Yeah,
who was still around not so many years ago. But he was just an ordinary sergeant in A Company when Ralph Kite was a platoon commander. When Ralph Kite was given command of the D Company, he became the company sergeant major, and he of course ended up with a DSM and all the rest of it. He was probably the outstanding NCO of the 52nd in World War I. But I can't answer directly Dr. Lawrence's question.
No, okay. On your stories of the battles that Kite was in and so on, it's remarkable to me, I must say, that you've got so much detail about the enemy, the people who the British battalions were fighting against. I can't believe that this was easy to find, easy to obtain, and yet you've got some wonderful photographs of these people who, of course, were very proud to be doing what they were doing in their own way. Of course, we understand that. But how on earth did you get all that stuff from the other side, so to speak?
Actually, it's right. That's quite difficult. I mean, there's a certain amount in Edmonds, you know, the official history. Cross put a certain amount in his articles in the journals. The Americans' intelligence services then did a complete coverage of all the German divisions, and that was published in a book, and I found that very helpful indeed. As regards the photographs, I spent an age on various websites, continental websites, where you can find these things. And in fact, most of the photographs actually came from a guy who's a lumberjack in the south of France, who I still sort of keep vaguely in touch with.
Yeah.
It's quite true. It is difficult to find out what went on from the other side. And it's only really latterly that I've actually picked this up in any detail. One of my brother's nephews by marriage has connections with people in Germany who actually came up with photographs of what the Richebourg-Lavouet trenches looked like from the German side, which I've illustrated, I think, certainly in one of the books.
Yeah.
But it is difficult.
Well, I congratulate you on it because it makes such a difference to the story and gives the other side a human face too. I'd like to take a 2-minute pause, Simon, if I could, for just a second or two, to thank people very much indeed for the donations which they've made to the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum for these talks. It's a wonderful thing to have established this communication with so many more people. as a result of these talks. And we're very, very grateful for all the support that we get, and particularly for the donations we've received tonight. They are the lifeblood of the museum, if I can put it like that, because you can guess that for the last 15 months or so, all museums, not only ours, but all museums have been going through a torrid time, a very difficult time, and with no visitors and therefore very limited income. For us, as a completely privately funded museum, these donations that you make to us as a result of our talks are absolutely wonderful and hugely appreciated. Thank you very much. Simon, let's come back to the questions now. And I've got a question here from Henry Spielberg, who says, an excellent talk, thank you. Could Dr. Harris comment on the treatment of Ralph Kite's wounds? Could they have been survivable?
Yes, they certainly could have been survivable. They should have been survivable, even in 1916. If he had been x-rayed and the shell shard had been removed at the beginning of the whole business, then it is unlikely that infection would have, there's certainly a possibility that infection wouldn't have set in and the artery wouldn't have burst. I took the advice of a very experienced vascular surgeon who felt that it was not direct trauma to the main artery, to the arm, the brachial artery, but it was infection that had eroded the wall of the artery, and that's why it burst. I mean, it might have become infected and he might have died anyway, but he certainly would have had a sporting chance if the shell shard had been removed. They didn't x-ray him. Edie Kite and her husband were very bitter about this. Number 10, British Red Cross Hospital, Lady Murray's, did not have x-ray facilities, but there were x-ray facilities in other hospitals in the Tréport. If they had whipped him out for a quick x-ray, the shell shard would have become apparent and could have been removed. The other thing about it is that I've had considerable experience of dealing with people after shoulder operations. The pain from shoulder surgery from shoulder wounds is extremely unpleasant. Some of the worst pain that you can actually get. Now, Kite put up with this for the best part of a month. Every time he breathed, the shell shard would have moved and he would have been in the most intense pain. And one of the most extraordinary things about it is that all the nurses said that however bad the pain was, he never made a murmur. And I think that is the most extraordinary thing. He suffered terribly. Today, if it had happened, he would have been x-rayed, and although his arm might well have been partially paralyzed, I suspect he would have lived.
It's a tragic tale, that. Thank you very much for that. Robin Draper, who served in the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry himself, wants to go back to Cross and what you've discovered really about the reasons why he never got further than command of a battalion in the war, and really what happened to him after the war.
Well, basically, the highlight of his life was command of the 52nd. He refused point blank to go to Staff College because he said, which would have allowed him to go on and command a brigade and all the rest of it. He wouldn't. He said, I'm not going to do that. He said, I've had more experience in war commanding my battalion than half these people who go off to Staff College. I'm not going to do it. And he was absolutely adamant post-war that he wouldn't.
Yep.
And he wrote to Edie, my great-grandmother, along these lines. He said, they want me to go to Staff College, but I won't do it. His whole life revolved around his regiment, as he called it, the 52nd. He didn't want to go further. And I mean, I'm sure he would have been successful as a brigade commander. He was certainly offered a brigade, but he declined it.
But after the war, then he soldiered on, didn't he? Because we got some of his stuff in the museum, which indicates that he became a company commander again, and that can't have been easy.
He went back to being the junior company commander when Archibald Eden came back and commanded the battalion when they were out in Cork. But he was very humble. He accepted that. And he couldn't really make up his mind whether he would try and hang on until, in the fullness of time, he would command the 52nd in peacetime. He couldn't make up his mind, but in the end, he decided in 1923, he could take no more. He did come back in the Second War in the Pioneer Corps, where he walked, I think it was 100 miles back to Bordeaux, aged 52, a suitable number for him, in order to escape the Germans. He also got a fifth mention in dispatches. He got 4 in the Great War for his activities with the Pioneer Corps and then the Home Guard.
Simon, a question here about friendly artillery fire and the dangers that British soldiers faced from their own artillery. He was most likely wounded by friendly artillery. I don't think it's conclusive, but the indications are that it was friendly artillery. It's a blue on blue, I'm afraid, we'd call it these days. How difficult did you find it was to establish this, actually?
If you go back to the battalion war diary, written in Cross's own fair hand, it says that he was hit accidentally. Later, Cross then criticised mildly, because Kite was one of his protégés and he was, greatly in favour of him. He said that he followed the barrage too closely. So that when I went into this, firstly, I found an intelligence document, I think it was in the 2nd Division's papers, saying that the part of the field artillery had been ordered to fire 18-pounders, I think it was, 50 yards short, but that no one had told the infantry that this was going to happen. So they were firing shorter than they were actually expecting. But the other thing was that there was a battalion of the Royal Fusiliers in front of the 52nd, in front of Ralph Kite's company. And he, in any case, he had his platoon commanders out leading the way, and he followed, as was custom, with his servant at the back of his company. There was a heck of a long distance between him and where the barrage should have been. General Gough, who actually commanded the overall action, had instructed the men to stay as close to the barrage as they possibly could. Ralph Kite was not the only person to be hit by friendly fire. I did take the shell shard to an expert who decided that he thought it was probably a 9.2 centimetre, or must be an inch, howitzer that had actually caused the trouble. The Canadian heavy artillery was supporting the 2nd Division that day, and it seems likely that it was their shell that actually fell where it did. He was unlucky. He was the second time, actually, he'd been hit by friendly fire. According to Corporal Jack Ward, who carried him in, he said, "Oh, that's the second time," because he was hit by a shell splinter on the Somme, which did remarkably little damage.
Simon, we've got a question here from Stephen Bamber. I know Stephen Bamber, but I can't remember if he's a doctor or not. I think he is a doctor. And he's coming back to the field hospitals having X-ray machines. He says here that the Harvard Field Hospital removed shards from the brain, presumably with X-ray in the Great War.
Yes, they did. I mean, when it came to the X-rays, X-ray machines were in the casualty clearing stations the year afterwards, in 1917, but they were certainly in many of the base hospitals in 1916. But of course, Harvard and their great neurosurgeon, whose name for the moment escapes me, were very advanced in the management of head injuries.
Yeah. Good. Thank you very much for that. Another question from Henry Spielberg about the 52nd junior officers. The 52nd, of course, being a regular battalion. And the question is, did any of the 52nd junior officers serve through the entire war and survive?
A few of them did, but not many. Cross used to have a little meeting with those that had actually gone through the whole war, but there were not many that actually did.
A reunion, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. No, well, the general expectation was that young officers would only survive 3 to 6 weeks or something.
3 weeks.
Appalling.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the questions occurs to me is about that magnificent building, which was Lady Murray's Hospital, which was a splendid building and ought to have survived. But I've been to the Tréport with you, Simon, and we both know it's not there anymore. What happened?
It's tragic, really. I went looking for it way back in the 90s, I think it was, and discovered that it was a building very similar, but obviously modern in style. Well, for reasons known best to themselves, in 1944, the SS decided to blow it up. And the then owner of it, a chap called Le Villiers, lay in the undergrowth and photographed them blowing it up. And in fact, his, I think it's his grandson who owns the Hotel de Calais, where you and I have both stayed, he actually sent me photographs of the SS blowing it up. And his grandfather apparently was hiding in the bushes to take the photographs. He was livid. He just finished paying the mortgage. It was then rebuilt in the similar style, slightly smaller, and was run by, I think it was the daughter, Marie Levelin. And I'm not sure she's still alive. I hope she is, but I'm sure her children run it. It's obviously a very popular hotel, particularly with the golfers and things of this sort. And camping. Yeah. They have been I have to say that family have been incredibly helpful towards me. My brother, Ralph, visited the new golf hotel, I think about a couple of years ago, and they showed him a table that in fact had been saved from the original hotel with carvings on it done by, one of the patients.
Some of the photographs of the cemetery where Ralph Kite lies now, most of the photographs actually that were shown tonight have behind, in the background, the road down which the funeral cortege came to the cemetery. And I know that road winds up the hill towards that building. And it's a very sort of evocative view, I think, that to look up that hill and to see that's where he died and that's the route he took to his final resting place. Simon, Alice Batt was a significant feature in this story. You cleverly discovered her diary, and we've got that wonderful story about it. But she was more than that, wasn't she? Because she not only served in the Tréport during the Great War and kept that diary, but she went on to do great things.
I mean, she was a GP's daughter, I understand, from Witney in Oxfordshire. She was educated at Wickham Abbey, but later in the war, after she dealt with Ralph Kite on his deathbed, what have you, she won the Albert Medal because there was a fire in an operating theatre, which I presume she helped put out. Now, poor Alice died in 1969, I think it was, and a couple of years later, the Albert Medal for survivors was converted into the George Cross. And I think that says something about, Alice Batt and her capabilities. She was an outstanding woman. I suppose it's about a year ago, I managed to, when I originally discovered a copy of the diary in the archives of the Red Cross, when I read her description of Ralph Kite's death and the quote about Very Parfit Gentil Knight, I literally nearly fell off the chair because I just couldn't believe what I was reading. I've tried a great deal to get hold of copies of the diary, but eventually came across one last summer in New Zealand. And I paid quite a large sum of money to bring it back from New Zealand. And I've given it to my brother Ralph to go with the letters and everything else. But she was an outstanding nurse and individual.
And we discovered only recently that before the war, she'd received a Royal Humane Society medal for pulling a drowning girl out of the sea in 1915, just at the outbreak of the war. So a remarkable personality altogether.
Indeed.
I think we've done pretty well with our questions tonight, Ralph. Simon, and thank you very much indeed for answering them so comprehensively and so fully. It's a terrific story you've uncovered for us, and I hope that people will feel inspired to look into their own family backgrounds. And I think this now would be a good. I've just seen another question from the indomitable Henry Spielberg, and this is about Bat. Is the Bat School in Witney named after her? Almost certainly, I suppose.
I think it's probably named after her father, the GP, isn't it? Or maybe it's named after her. I don't know.
You did mention that she came from Witney, so maybe there are still members of the Bat family not far from the museum in Woodstock. That would be terrific to, if they could take an interest in the museum or make contact if anybody is there. The answer is to Henry Spielberg, probably after her father. I hope you got that. Anyway, that's perhaps more research to come out. And that's one of the interesting things about these personal stories, that several more strands of inquiry can be uncovered. Simon, I think we should go on.
Before I vanish from the screen, may I just congratulate you on an excellent talk. I think you have done Ralph Kite proud. Thank you.
Well, it was a particular pleasure for Fiona and me to accompany your family to the graveside to mark the 100th anniversary of his burial in December 1916. And Fiona and I often talk about it, and we talk about the way in which we feel that Ralph Kite somehow lives on now. We've seen the embodiment of Ralph Kite's life brought to life again in a way in the young family that you took there that day. One of the remarkable things was that as we walked up to the cemetery, I remember we were greeted by the mayor of Le Tréport with his tricolour sash around him, and two trumpeters, weren't they? Two trumpeters who played the last post as well as I've ever heard it. And that was for Ralph Kite. And there weren't many dry eyes in the cemetery that day. I have to tell you that we are very touched still by reading the story of Ralph Kite and the way you have brought him and his story back to life, Simon. So congratulations on that. But I think we should let you go now. And thank you very much for that. Can I close therefore by saying to E.P. Barras a huge thank you again for sponsoring our talk tonight. I can't tell you what a difference it makes to the soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum to be able to receive this sponsorship and actually spread the name of the museum around the county a bit more. That's a wonderful thing for us. So a big cheer from us to E.P. Barras. A huge cheer for Simon Harris for, of course, his scholarship, of course, his work on uncovering Ralph Kite and telling the story, but also for joining us tonight and for so readily engaging in our live Q&A, Simon. Thank you very much indeed. You certainly deserve a good gin and tonic tonight, I can tell you. We've got two more Great War talks on the stocks coming up. Unfortunately, I can't give you dates for these yet, but they are about the fairly unknown, little known, I should say, campaign in the Great War in Mesopotamia. The 1st Battalion, the 43rd of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, were part of the Indian Army Force, the 6th Division, which was fighting in Mesopotamia along the Tigris line and came to a very, very difficult and tragic end, actually, and that we'll be telling the story of that campaign shortly. And another story, completely different this time. Everybody recognizes this. It's the story of Winnie the Pooh. And the story we're going to be telling is not of A.A. Milne or indeed of Christopher Robin, but it's the story of E.H. Shepard, the artist who drew Winnie the Pooh. And when we think of Winnie the Pooh, all of us grew up with him, when we think of him, we think of that little brown bear, which was the creation of E.H. Shepard. E.H. Shepard did all that after the Great War, but in the war, he was an artillery officer, and he produced some magnificent drawings of his time in France and in northern Italy in the First World War. And I'm very pleased to be able to say that James Campbell, who is the chairman of the E.H. Shepard Trust, will tell us about that and tell us something of his art during the Great War, which is going to be a very different sort of story, as you can guess. But for now, thank you very much indeed, everybody, again, and thank you very much indeed for your donations. All I can say is please keep them coming, because we jolly well need them and really appreciate them. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, and good night.